is an overview of policy transitions in India's industrial sector since independence. So quite a vast scope. And obviously, given that vast scope, I cannot go into too much detail on any particular policy. Maybe we can pick up on details if people are interested in the question and answer session. Otherwise, this is going to try and cover as much ground as possible, even at the cost of being somewhat superficial on each specific policy. Right? And I've divided the presentation into 3 parts covering 3 phases. One is the pre-reform period since independence until up to the 1980s. The second is the process of economic reforms from the 1980s up to 2017. And the last part, in which I'll go into much more detail because that is more contemporary, that will deal with problems that have arisen and policies that have been announced since 2017, especially after the COVID crisis has struck. But we'll see that problems were getting worse even before COVID, as far as industry is concerned. All right, so let's begin. Now, as most of you probably know, the Indian economy, after undergoing 2 centuries of colonialism, inherited at independence a very lopsided industrial or economic structure. There had been deindustrialization of traditional manufacturers in the 19th century. In the 20th century, especially in the interwar period, the colonial government, for its own motives and partly due to the pressure from the growing Indian entrepreneurial class and the national movement, allowed some modern industries to be set up. And the growth rate of industry was about 4% per annum from 1918 to 48, after being negligible or negative in the preceding century. The structure of the economy inherited at independence was one in which manufacturing contributed only about 14% of national income and employed about 10% of the labor force, of which only 2% were in what would be called modern industry. The rest in traditional industries, typically household industries using traditional technology, not employing wage labor, or at least at most 1 or 2 helpers, and basically what would be called petty commodity production. Just keep these figures in mind: 14% of national income and 10% of the labor force, because we'll want to compare with what was achieved in the subsequent period of almost 75 years. The composition of industry in this period was primarily based on agricultural raw materials, cotton and jute textiles, sugar and vegetable oils, or on processing of minerals, especially iron and steel. So that was the structure of the economy at independence. There was a noticeable gap in production of capital goods and most consumer goods, especially modern, those produced by modern large-scale industry. So the industrial policy, which really came together only in 1956 with the second plan and the industrial policy resolution that was announced that year, really began the process of planned development and industrialization with a particular industrial policy. And one way to summarize the three pillars of this policy are the three Ps: planning, protection, and the public sector. Planning, basically, although elaborate plan models were drawn up, essentially it meant planning of public sector investments, although targets were set for the private sector because the government did not have direct control of the private sector. It had many controls, but they were restrictive controls rather than promotional. It could prevent the private sector from investing in particular areas, but it could not force the private sector to invest so as to meet the planned targets. Second was protection from import competition. We'll see what the instruments of that policy were. And third, of course, was the public sector, which was supposed to occupy the so-called commanding heights of the economy. Nowadays, of course, it is fashionable to say this was all a bad mistake due to India's commitment to socialism or Nehruvian socialism. I would question that characterization because this was really not socialism. It was a highly regulated capitalism with a more active role for the government than in many other developing countries. But many important components of what would be a truly socialistic industrial policy were missing. And I'll come back to this later. There were serious problems with the policy that was followed, and I'll deal with those in some detail. But first, I want to dispel this wrong impression that it was a socialist kind of strategy that was followed. Of course, there was a lot of rhetoric, commitment to a socialist pattern of society. The so-called Avadi session of the then ruling party made it part of its manifesto. But in fact, many of the elements of this policy had nothing to do with socialism as it isn't normally defined. Most of the regulations that were imposed on industry were actually based on the Defense of India rules, which were enforced by the colonial government in 1939 to meet the needs of wartime defense production. And the same powers were adapted and strengthened and put into place, not put into place, they were extended by the independent government, the government of India at independence, in fact in 1951, in the form of the Industries Development and Regulation Act. Moreover, the commanding heights of the economy, although part of the rhetoric of socialism, was definitely part of a perspective put forward by the leading industrialists who met in Bombay in 1944 and put forward what came to be known as the Bombay Plan. The biggest industrialists of the time, including representatives of the Birlas and the Tatas and many other industrialists who have faded from the limelight in recent years, but they were definitely major captains of industry in the 1940s. They all endorsed a plan for the transition to independence and for the post-independence government, giving a leading role to public investment in heavy industries and infrastructure. So that policy was not imposed on an unwilling capitalist class by a socialist-minded government. It was very much something the capitalist class knew they were unable to do themselves because of their own limitations, but which they required for the promotion of their own industries at the time in the early stages of development. And this is, in fact, the pattern which has been followed in many other late developing countries and also developed countries. That is, the countries we now call developed countries, most of them industrialized by protecting their domestic markets from import competition. And many of them also had active government investment in infrastructure and also to a certain extent in industry. Not the United States and not so much in Britain, but in continental Europe and certainly in Japan. These were all elements of the industrial strategy. Protection was followed by all countries which successfully industrialized, following the pattern of so-called import substituting industrialization. And the United States was right at the forefront of this policy through much of the 19th century. So this package of 3 Ps, planning, of course, got a bad name because of its association with the Soviet Union. But at the time, it was regarded as a great success. The Soviet Union in the 1950s was industrializing rapidly and causing concern to American industrialists and people in government that they were set to be overtaken. Of course, that burst of growth did not last very long. But at least in the 1950s, this was not such an obviously wrong policy to follow as we, or as many commentators judge it today with the benefit of hindsight. All right, so what were the specific policies? Well, you've all heard of the famous, or now infamous, Mahalanobis model, which yes, is there?
नाही आणि जेव्हा आपण काही चर्चा करतो त्याचं तिथले तिथं पण इकडे तिकडे ते पण
Is someone asking a question, or is that some background interference? Okay, maybe there was some background noise. Priority was to be given to investments in capital goods industries so as to improve the investment rate in the economy, because in the Mahalanobis model, the only way to step up the investment rate and increase the very low level of capital endowment in the economy was to produce capital goods domestically, because of what was perceived as limited opportunities of importing capital goods because of perceived export pessimism. That was again something common in development thinking of the 1950s, that developing countries were specialized in exports of primary products, which were faced by inelastic world demand. Therefore, they could not hope to industrialize by exporting primary products and importing manufactures and capital goods. So in this scheme of things, domestic production of capital goods was the only way to boost the investment rate in the economy. 3 industries, armaments, railways, and atomic energy, were exclusively reserved for the public sector. And new establishments in 14 other industries were to be set up only by the state, and was also to acquire, in these 14 other industries, existing private sector enterprises would be allowed to continue, but increasingly the state would set up only the state would be permitted to set up new units in these 14 industries. And maybe the participants could kindly mute their mics, because I know we're all at home. We all have families and home activities taking place in the background. And so it might be helpful if participants could mute their mics until the question and answer session. Or if anyone wants to interject with a clarificatory question, I think there's a provision for doing that by raising your hand virtually, and I'll be very happy to take that kind of question. Okay, so otherwise I can't tell when I hear something whether it's someone asking a question or someone's mic is picking up background noise. Yes, so progressively increasing role for state-owned enterprises, or what we would now call public sector units. Now, as I said, the planned targets for the private sector could be met by regulating the investments and output of the private sector. And so what came to be known as the license permit Raj was introduced, which required government permission for setting up new manufacturing capacity, import of capital goods by firms, private sector firms, import of raw materials and components, foreign collaboration for technology, and raising funds from the domestic capital market. And this became a huge, cumbersome web of controls, because each such license had to be obtained from a different agency, some requiring multiple clearances from each agency. And there were no clear criteria for allotment, which would give the private sector entrepreneurs some sense of what would be approved and what would not be approved. This was a recipe for arbitrariness, inefficient allocation, and corruption, because the bureaucrats in charge of each of these licenses, even if they were honest, they followed their own ad hoc procedures and did not have a good sense of what was permissible, what kind of activity should be permitted and what should not be permitted. The procedures they used, even if they were honest, were based on either past practice or whether the industrialist had already got some in principle foreign collaboration. And very often, of course, the allocating bureaucrats were not honest, and maybe the ministers behind them encouraged this. And so this led to widespread corruption. And existing businesses of some of the large industrial houses captured the licenses. Even if they did not want to use them, they captured them as what we would today call a barrier to entry, to keep out potential competitors. And so the policy that was followed was really the very opposite of an industrial policy, which Professor Murthy said we are lacking today. In name, it was an industrial policy, but an industrial policy has a clear set of guidelines and criteria for which sectors are to be promoted, on what grounds, and for how long. None of this was laid down by the central authorities. They had a list of objectives, but did not recognize the possibility of trade-offs and contradictions between those objectives. So naturally, industry was caught in this web of controls. And by the mid-1960s, many official committees who looked into this brought out the evidence of all these growing lacunae in the industrial policy. As far as protection was concerned, tariff rates were amongst the highest in the world, 300%. Although I said many other countries had followed a policy of protection and import substitution, their tariff protection seldom reached such high levels, which gave an inordinate degree of protection to domestic industry and cushioned it from the need to maintain some degree of competitiveness, at least over time. So the infant industries that came up were perpetual infants that never grew up. And the policy of tariff protection, which was the normal protectionist strategy used in most other countries, was supplemented by a policy of import licensing, or what are called quantitative restrictions for equipment and raw materials. And to get those licenses, the industrialists had to get a government agency, different government agencies, to certify essentiality, that is, whether that particular import was essential for the activity or the industry that they were planning to set up or to expand. That might have been relatively easy, but the second criterion was the criterion of indigenous non-availability. This means that they had to certify, some government agency had to certify that that particular imported capital good or component or raw material was not available domestically, regardless of cost or quality. That is, any domestic substitute ruled out the possibility of importing, even if that domestically produced substitute was much more expensive than the import, even after applying the tariff, or was far inferior or represented more obsolete technology. This effectively gave complete protection of Indian producers from import competition, much more so than a high tariff. So it worked like a prohibitive tariff, but in fact worse than that, because there were some theoretical contributions in the mid-1960s by Jagdish Bhagwati in particular, who showed that the same degree of import protection given by a quantitative control would be much worse than the same degree of import protection given by a tariff. So that was the situation, and this system of controls proliferated in the 1970s. I've just listed a few of them. The Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, or MRTP Act, imposed another layer of controls on the so-called large or dominant undertakings, that is, firms which at that time had assets greater than 20 crores, which sounds extremely low nowadays, but was a very large unit in 1969 when the MRTP Act was passed. It required them to get additional permission for either expansion or setting up a new unit or a merger. And again, the process of giving this permission was highly non-transparent and discretionary. And there were allegations of favoritism or denying permission on completely extraneous grounds. Then there was the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, or FERA, which imposed a 40% cap on foreign equity, except in export-oriented or high-tech activities. So this was a control on the degree of foreign ownership, which was a disincentive to foreign direct investment. MRTP and FERA companies were restricted to investing in a specified list of industries only. They could not invest outside. Now, this was not enforced very consistently. Various reports in later years showed that these companies were in fact investing in industries outside the specified list, but presumably that was again a use of discretionary power with some quid pro quo involved. Then there was a sharp increase in the number of items reserved for small-scale industries, which had always been there since the 1950s, typically to protect the so-called khadi and village industries because of the influence of Gandhian thinking at the time. But the number of the items that were so reserved expanded to cover items that were produced by modern mechanized industry as well, not just low technology handicraft industries as earlier. Then there was the policy of nationalization of Sikh industries, which was part and parcel of the wave of nationalization at the time, beginning with banks and coal mines, but also particular industries, supposedly to protect the employment of the workers there. But this saddled the government with Sikh industries. So from an infant industry or a nursery for industries, the government became an ICU for industries because many of them just could not be revived. And although most of these earlier policies were implemented by the central government, individual state governments to bail out failing industries in their states also nationalized some of them, which saddled state governments with chronically loss-making enterprises, which proved a drain on their budgets. Then, of course, there was a new Patents Act, which was introduced in 1970. And this did not allow for product patents, which is the usual way in which patenting is done to protect the incentive to innovate. What was patentable in India was a process patent, but this meant that Indian industrialists could produce products that had been developed and patented abroad because they did not have patent protection in India. They could produce them by using, even if the process used abroad was patented, Indian industrialists could reverse engineer and adapt the production technology to produce the same items with a different patent. And of course, as we all know, the pharmaceutical industry in India really benefited from this. And that really gave rise to our very large and now internationally competitive pharmaceutical industry, which has really been a boon in the recent times especially. But it may, this degree of patent protection may have discouraged foreign firms from bringing in their latest technology, because not all foreign patented products can be produced by simply copying and adapting foreign technology. You really need to have it in your backyard. There's a lot of literature on what are called FDI spillovers. That is, foreign firms investing in your country promotes the dissemination of technology, even if there is some degree of intellectual property protection. Simply the competition from the foreign enterprises and the movement of skilled labor from the foreign to the domestic industries brings with it new ideas and ability to adapt recent technology. And if foreign firms are discouraged from entering, then they are not going to bring the latest technology. So they were discouraged directly through the FERA, that is the restriction on the amount of equity they could invest. They were discouraged by the general web of controls and licensing, and they were discouraged by the lack of patentability of their frontline technologies. So this brings me close to the end of the first part, which is the pre-reform period, and a quick overview of evaluation. Definitely the growth rate of industry improving to 7.5% per annum on average to the mid-60s after, remember that figure of 4%, even in the relatively benign conditions of the interwar period under the colonial government. So this was a definite step up. Creation of a broad-based manufacturing sector because of the degree of protection granted from foreign imports. India developed industries which very few other developing countries could boast of at a comparable state of development. But the lack of competition and the restrictions on size due to investment licensing, MRTP, FERA, and import controls led to an uncompetitive manufacturing sector. And policies to protect handlooms in particular discouraged production and investment in the modern textile sector, which was the sector in which many other developing countries raced far ahead, the so-called East Asian miracle economies. Began with modern textiles, and just at the time when the advanced countries were cutting back on their domestic textile production as they shifted away to more sophisticated products. So the East Asian and Southeast Asian economies were able to fill that gap. India missed the bus very badly. Then there were the chronic losses incurred by the PSUs, both the ones that were set up at the high tide of the commanding heights philosophy and the ones that were the nationalized Sikh private sector units. As a result of this lack of competitiveness, India's share of world trade fell from about 2% or sometimes 2.5% to less than 1/2%. And the crisis deepened as the industrial growth rate fell back to about 4% in 1965 to 1980. So that gradually created the conditions for reforms, which began very slowly in the 1980s. We normally think that reforms began with a big bang in 1991. But in fact, many small incremental reforms, or what were called creeping reforms, were introduced in the 1980s. Licensing system was liberalized to allow for what was called substantial expansion beyond the license capacity. And there was what was the policy of so-called broadbanding, that is, firms given a license for one product could produce other products within the same broad category without getting separate licenses for each of them. Many industries were actually completely delicensed. And this was all from the mid-1980s, actually, not the entire decade of the 1980s. This was roughly from about 1984. And the asset limit for the MRTP companies, remember, it was the additional permissions required for companies with capital of more than 20 crores. That threshold was raised to 100 crores. So nearly a quarter of companies between 20 and 100 crores went out of the scope of the MRTP Act. Now, in terms of what the effect of this was, it did result in an acceleration of the growth rate, but this was at least partly in the late 1980s, at least, due to large unsustainable fiscal deficits incurred by both the central and state governments. So that contributed to the huge crisis of 1991, along with other unforeseeable developments, such as the first Gulf War, the resulting increase in the price of oil, the repatriation of Indian migrant workers, etc. But the conditions were already quite precarious even before that. So the crisis of 1991 more or less forced the government's hand. There's still a debate as to whether it was forced by international agencies like the World Bank and IMF as a precondition for bailing India out of that crisis, or whether Indian policymakers already had that plan, and they, as some of them have now, in recent years, they have all been boasting that that plan was, the reform plans were always there, and the crisis only gave them the opportunity to push them through. So anyway, we don't want to go into who was responsible. We want to look at what were those reforms and what were the consequences. So the reforms basically dismantled a lot of the policies that had been put in place in earlier years. Almost all the remaining industries were delicensed. The MRTP Act was amended to remove restrictions on expansion and mergers by large firms, which thereafter went on an expansion and merger binge, you might say, because I worked somewhat on merger policy, and you can see from the data huge boost to mergers immediately after 1991. Partly this was related to the earlier control regime, because many Indian business houses had over-diversified. That is, they had invested in many different industries because their expansion was limited in particular industries by the license permit Raj. So instead, they just spread out, and they also had stakes in many different companies in many different industries. After the licensing restrictions were removed and the MRTP Act was amended, they wanted to consolidate and focus on, well, many of them wanted to consolidate, some of them wanted to continue to diversify, but many of the financially less strong ones wanted to consolidate and focus on a fewer areas, and expand in those areas. So there was a shake-up or churning in the industrial sector, where firms offloaded, even some of the large business groups offloaded some of their stakes, or sold off completely some of their firms to others, so as to rationalize their portfolios. Then, of course, almost all industries that had earlier been reserved for the public sector were now progressively opened up, and the FERA restrictions on foreign direct investment were abolished. Reforms in the capital markets took place, allowing Indian private firms to raise equity capital without going to this agency called the Controller of Capital Issues, which was abolished, and letting the capital markets decide on how much equity could be issued and at what price an IPO could be launched. And there was also trade liberalization in the form of reduction of the tariffs and abolition of import licensing requirements for almost all items except those of a strategic nature or those on grounds of public health. So you can see that the 1990s reform were far more broad-based and went much further than the 1980s reforms, but definitely there were steps taken in the 1980s, which we should not forget. Now coming closer to the present time, we have accelerating reforms, and I'm taking the story to 2017 for a particular reason, because I have a separate concluding section on developments since 2017, because that is really what we are living through. So a quick summary of these reforms of the early part of this century. The remaining reservation for small-scale industries was progressively abolished, mainly by about 2005, but a few items still remained, and those items were de-reserved by 2015. So that was the last relic, really, of the license permit Raj. More promotional kind of policies introduced included the Special Economic Zones Act, where in designated zones, private industry would be given tax concessions and easy clearances, and also better infrastructure. Then something I'll be talking about next week, the Competition Act was introduced in 2003, although for certain reasons it was enforced only from 2009. And the basic, although I'll go into details next week, the basic philosophy here was different from that of the MRTP Act, which was also a competition act. But under the MRTP Act, the philosophy was to restrict the size and growth of large firms. But in the Competition Act, there is no prohibition on size and growth as such. The focus is on deterring anti-competitive behavior in certain forms, which we'll talk about next week. Then India entered into something that's become very controversial now, preferential trade agreements, especially with Southeast Asian countries, because the process of what is called multilateral trade liberalization under the auspices of the WTO started stalling around this time, the early years of this century, because the developed countries wanted impossible concessions by the developing countries, and the developing countries felt they had been cheated by signing the original WTO agreement of 1995. They did not get what they expected, and they were expected to give up even more. So as an alternative, there was growth of regional or preferential trade agreements, and India also signed up a few of those. Then more recently, and the current government policy of Make in India and of promoting ease of doing business, that is making it easier to comply with government regulations, either by abolishing the regulations themselves if they are out of date, or making it easier to comply in terms of the clearances that one has to get and the number of forms that have to be filed in order to comply with those regulations. Then the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code introduced in 2016, because one of the legacies of the license permit Raj, especially after the government stopped becoming an old age home or an ICU and taking over sick units, units kept going sick, largely because of the increase in competition caused by reduction of import restrictions and allowing expansion of large domestic units. Many firms just could not cope. They could not compete. So they went sick. They could not pay their workers or their suppliers or their creditors. The then prevailing system or systems for recovery of debt were really not working. So this new IBC was introduced, which seemed to be more streamlined in allowing such firms to be taken over by new management, which would settle the liabilities outstanding to financial creditors in particular, but also other parties. And in case no other entrepreneur was willing to take on this, then the stressed firm would have to go into liquidation. That is, its assets would be sold off, and whatever could be raised from the sale of assets would be used to pay off the liabilities in a particular priority order. That hasn't been working too well, but we'll come to that in a minute. And then, of course, within the 2000 to 2017 period, the goods and services tax, with many desirable features, one indirect tax rather than multiple tax imposed by the center, and shared revenues shared with the states instead of multiple taxes imposed by the center and the states at different rates. So this, in principle, should have reduced tax evasion, avoiding multiple taxes, tax competition between the states in order to induce industry to set up there. The cascading effect of multi-stage taxation, that is an industrial process that goes through multiple stages of production in different firms, would mean that each firm would be paying the input cost, including the tax, and then marking up that input cost and paying another tax when it sold its output to the next firm in the supply chain, and so on. So this is called a cascading effect, which is hard to administer and also increases the price unduly. And of course, obstacles to interstate movement of goods. We all remember the days when traveling from one state to another, at every state border, there would be long lines of trucks waiting to pay the so-called octroi tax. And that led to huge delays and also wastage of fuel and efficiency of timely delivery. So once again, to close this part, since I think I'm more or less keeping to time, keeping in view the need for some discussion. Once again, if we look at the growth rate, the industrial growth rate again picked up to 7 to 8% per year up to 2017. Things deteriorated after that. But, and this is why I asked you to keep in mind the figures from the first slide, that is the Indian economy at independence. You can see that the share of manufacturing has hardly improved. It was 14% then, and it's fluctuating between 15 to 17% in recent years. And 12% in employment, it was 10% then. Probably the only change is a much greater part of this is in the form of organized sector employment. And the unorganized sector has become a much smaller component. Another cause for concern, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, is the falling employment elasticity of production. Employment elasticity is in principle similar to a price elasticity or income elasticity. In this case, it's percentage change in ratio of percentage change in employment to percentage change in output. This has fallen very low, so that even if the growth rate of output picks up, the growth rate of employment lags far, far behind. Then looking at what this has meant for workers and employment, apart from employment growing very slowly, most industrial workers are employed in manufacturing units that are either very large or very small. This is what is called the missing middle, and this is in stark contrast to the pattern observed in other developing countries where the middle of the size distribution is the largest. They don't have so many really small firms, and small here means really small with just a handful of workers, 3 or 4 or 5 workers. So that middle is usually the most dynamic component of industry in other developing countries. Most workers have no job security or benefits, and this has deteriorated over time. And the share of wages in value added has fallen sharply. So when we look at industrial growth, we should not look only at output or investment. We should also look at what it means for all the stakeholders in industrial growth, which should include workers. And the reason I terminate this part here is that things started deteriorating from 2018. That is 2 years before the onslaught of the COVID pandemic. And I can show you that in this chart. Just ignore the patterns that comes from the yellow lines come from the template of the PowerPoint slide. I should have chosen a blank one, but to just look at the blue chart, you can see the industrial growth rate bouncing around, but by and large from 7 to 8%, a surge in 2015-16, again dropping to 7 to 8%. And then from early 2018, it starts declining. And then of course we have the COVID shock, but the decline begins before the COVID shock. Right? So that's something to be kept in mind. There were some pre-existing problems before COVID turned everything upside down. So let's see what were those pre-existing problems. So this is what I call pre-COVID challenges. And I've categorized this in terms of the familiar Keynesian identity, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. That is on the demand side. Each of these engines of demand were beginning to slow down. As far as consumption was concerned, there was a deepening agrarian crisis, which has now rudely come to our attention after being ignored for too long because of the recent developments. There was the impact of twin shocks, that is demonetization and GST, especially on the informal sector, which functioned mainly on the basis of cash and so was hard hit by demonetization and found it too complex to comply with the documentation required for GST if they were part of subcontracting or supply chains of the organized sector industry, because you have to be able to give GST vouchers to get input tax credit, and if they could not provide this to the next firm in the supply chain, then they were just no longer acceptable as suppliers. So let me just go back here because the data does not seem to really confirm this. Demonetization was in November 2016, so we do see a decline from here, but the growth rate was already declining before demonetization and it became negative. But then there was a smart recovery. Similarly, for GST, which was introduced in the middle of 2017-18, the second quarter, the growth rate actually picked up after GST and then started declining. So it's not very clear that you can make an immediate association, but what is well known is that the unorganized or informal sector is undercounted in GDP estimations. And so maybe the full impact is not visible in this chart. Then private investment was discouraged by the problem of debt overhang. This is what's called the twin balance sheet problem. That is, banks had overextended because in the boom years of roughly 2003 to 2008, banks were flush with funds. They were lending money without due diligence, or maybe because of political pressure. And many of these loans turned into non-performing assets, NPAs. And this created twin balance sheet problem. That is, the bank's balance sheets were encumbered by these non-performing assets, and the borrowers, the private sector borrowers, their liabilities meant that they had liabilities they could not repay, and therefore they could not raise funds either in the form of equity or debt for their operations. And a large component of their revenues went to service their debt. So investment, both from the side of lenders and from the side of potential borrowers, started falling dramatically from about 2013 onwards, and this became worse in recent years. Then the Reserve Bank of India started targeting inflation, which was getting out of hand at that time, and real interest rates on giving loans were extremely high until 2018, and this further reduced investment activity. So that's C and I. What about G? Government spending was constrained by the fact that GST revenues were far, far below expectations and forecasts. At the same time, the FRBM Act, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Maintenance Act, had imposed limits on the deficits that the central government could incur. So they had to constrain their spending. There was growing expenditure commitment on account of bank recapitalization. Successive budgets put aside thousands of crores to recapitalize the banks to bring them back to health, but it was really bad money after good. It didn't succeed in most cases. There were loan waivers and the so-called Uday scheme, because another chronic drain on government finances was the state power utilities, and one-time effort to bail them out and convert their obligations into debt was the Uday scheme, but this means the government put in a lot more good money after the bad money. And in order to keep the deficits within some limits, the government cut back on infrastructure investment, actually governments, including state governments. At the same time, the external situation deteriorated. There was a slowdown in the major foreign markets and rising protectionism, which was manifested in almost all countries raising trade barriers. Britain moving out of the European Union, the growing US-China trade war, the erosion of world trade rules as the countries found loopholes in the WTO agreements, and India also did the same. And at this time, there was also real appreciation of the rupee because foreign capital kept flooding into the country, appreciating the rupee, which of course, as we all know, leads to deteriorating competitiveness of exports. So that was the scenario on the demand side. Then there were challenges on the supply side. As we all know, because we've all lived through this, land acquisition became a major issue because of displacement of local communities and the holdout, because everyone even if compensation is given, those who hold out till the latest, their land becomes more crucial for acquisition, and therefore they may get a better deal. So everyone would prefer to hold out rather than accept the compensation, unless the government uses its power of what's called eminent domain and forcibly acquires the land. And we know that that became a major political issue, and that is no longer that easy. Then, of course, environmental clearance has always been an issue in setting up of industry, a trade-off between environmental protection and industrial development. On labor, major complaint of Indian industry has been that India's labor laws are what they call archaic. They impose unreasonable restrictions on flexibility, on what's called hiring and firing. I myself have written extensively on this. You can see my latest paper. You can check it up on my homepage. I'll be happy to send the link to anyone who's interested. But labor is not only a question of hiring and firing. You need good human capital. And this has been something that has always been neglected. The business we are all involved in, education, we are only involved at the really the tip of the iceberg, that is in the good quality, reasonably good quality central universities. But we know the general scenario for university education, and more so skill education and school education, is pathetic in India. And this is where I would say it would be a caricature to say India at any time followed a socialistic path of development, because in any genuinely socialistic country or government, whether of the old Eastern European kind or the Western European democratic socialism, or even the countries that never pretend to call themselves socialist in East and Southeast Asia or Latin America, they have all done far, far better in terms of educating their population. And that feeds into the kind of workers or employees, both white collar and blue collar, that emerge from the system. Then there has been falling labor force participation rate, especially for rural females. For the last 15 years or so, there's a big debate about what is causing that. But that means basically large chunks of the potential labor force are not in the labor force, not because they are unemployed, because they are not willing or able to come forward for employment, even in times when employment was more widely available. And this again is a major contrast with all other developing countries, especially East Asia. So this section on supply side challenges, I've grouped under land, labor, and capital, the three major factors of production. Capital, we've already seen there was an NPA problem or a twin balance sheet problem, but that in the last 3 years has stretched to the so-called non-bank financial corporations. And this has led to what some people call a quadruple balance sheet problem, or a twin balance sheet problem, or simply a twin times 2 balance sheet problem. That is now 2 categories of financial institutions, both banks and non-bank financial institutions, suffer from the problem of NPAs. And these 2 are interconnected because the non-bank financial companies borrowed extensively from the commercial banks. So if the NBFCs run into trouble, that means bad loans or NPAs of the banks who had lent money to them also increases. And it's from the demand side, the NBFCs get cut off from borrowing more from the banks who have burnt their fingers. So the NBFCs are unable to extend credit to their traditional borrowers as well. So it's really a magnification of the earlier twin balance sheet problem. The IBC, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code process, got severely bogged down by legal disputes and is now under suspension because of the COVID crisis. But the number of cases that could get resolved was far less than was anticipated, and there were many more delays than anticipated. And then there were, as there have been right from the 1950s, corporate governance issues. Indian corporates have become proficient at diverting the funds of what they have borrowed to their other, what are called related parties, that is other companies owned not very openly, but owned by the same promoters. And so many companies are left as shells, merely as a means for borrowing money and then diverting it either to the private pockets of the promoters or to their other companies where there might be private limited companies, so there are no shareholders to share the money with, or they are relocated to tax havens abroad through various channels. So that brings me to 2017. I did have there's a little more. There were growing issues of infrastructure, especially power, transport, and communications, because of long-term financing issues, because governments have been reluctant to impose user charges especially for power given away free, or the large what are called transmission and distribution losses. So the distribution companies are chronically sick, whether public sector or private sector, and the Uday scheme has not really succeeded in restoring them to health. Then technology, the Indian corporate sector is notorious for spending very little on research and development. And as far as institutions are concerned, you know very well what the issues are. I just point out that although India's rank in the World Bank's ease of doing business index has jumped up by about 70 places in 2 years, on two components, it remains near the bottom. And one of them is poor contract enforcement. It takes years and years to enforce a simple commercial contract. The other is property, acquiring a property. So until these deep-rooted issues are resolved, there will remain many, many problems confronting Indian industry. Whatever liberalization or control policy is put in place, there is an underlying set of much deeper issues that we have not really been able to confront very successfully. Okay, I did have a couple of slides on responses to COVID, but since this is really ongoing, it's something you read about in the newspapers. And the effects of whatever policies the government has introduced or relaxed are yet to be seen. It's too recent. And since we're running out of time, I think I'll stop here and invite any questions. We have about 15 minutes, I think. And
you're within the limit. I mean, we have still, I think, 14 to 15 minutes for the question answers.
Yeah.
And,
so there are two questions already on the chat. Would you like me to read it to you, or
can everyone see the chat, or is it only?
You can also view it.
Let me see.
Geeta Mandal and we would take up participants' questions first.
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, for some reason, I can't find my.
But I'll read it to you.
Why don't you read them out, Rama? Yeah.
Although we always talk about manufacturing growth rate, in fact, there are always structured industrial policies. However, there was a recent article which discussed that our service sector is growing more than industrial sector. It is in contrast with many developing countries. Moreover, recent policies have hit really hard our manufacturing sector. What can be the policy prescription or at least some steps which can pull our manufacturing industries out of this situation?
Oh, that's a huge question. Part of it I thought I had answered, but let me first address the first part. Yes, the services sector has grown much faster than manufacturing. In fact, the Indian pattern of development is possibly unique because that transition which we learned about as students and probably some of us still teach, that is the Kuznets transition of moving first from agriculture to industry and then to services, that has not been witnessed in India. India has largely bypassed the manufacturing sector, and whatever transition has taken place is largely to the services sector, which has been relatively dynamic until recently, because the segments of the services sector have been hard hit by COVID. That is those sectors that require face-to-face contact. Yes, so that, and this is not something recent. This is something I remember reading about back in the 1980s. So it began around then and has only accelerated in recent years. But we must remember that there are different kinds of services, some of which are basically supporting industry. So we cannot completely separate them. Many services like government service or education, the business which we are in, or trade, hotels and restaurants, or retail trade, they might function separately from industry, but many services provide support to manufacturing. And there are some recent papers that look at that interrelationship also. The second part of the question, what can be done to revive it? I think I haven't provided any solutions. That's not my role here, but I have at least tried to draw attention to the problems and the priorities that need to be put in place. I don't think any of these problems can be solved very simplistically or very quickly by any practical solution, because whatever solutions have been tried, for example, the IBC process for the capital market or the different land acquisition acts passed by different governments, to solve the land acquisition problem, they have really not solved the problems they were supposed to solve. But that's the nature of institutions. They're much harder to change than simply saying, reduce this tariff or remove that licensing requirement. These are much, much harder. It remains to be seen whether the labor reforms have their projected effects. That's also an institutional change, a huge one, but I had actually flagged that. Yeah, consolidation of liberalization into 4 labor codes, but I have my doubts. Anyway, I think that's about all I can say on that question. There was some more questions.
Sir, from Mahalanobis model to market model of industrialization, can India find out the industrial development in its proper sense?
Oh, I think it's time to forget the Mahalanobis model. It was an important part of history. There was a debate about whether it was appropriate even at that time. But as I said, many countries followed import substitution. Many countries gave a prominent role to the public sector. Not many countries gave that much emphasis to developing their capital goods sector at such an early stage of development. Those that did so, for example, Korea also started out with labor-intensive industries and then moved up into heavy engineering, shipbuilding, and so on at a later stage. Ditto China. So that is something unusual in the Indian context. Whatever it is, it was a choice we made in the 1950s. It took some time to move away from there, but I don't think anyone can say it was all good or all bad.
So one last question.
Yes.
Question regarding the FDI policy before and after Make in India. Sir,
Sir, can I interrupt? Yes,
Let
sir.
her finish this question at least.
Yeah, this is my question actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I am Dr. Tufan Patra
Yeah.
from IMS Ghaziabad. Thank you, sir, for your wonderful lecture. So I enjoyed the lecture.
Thank you.
I have a question actually about the FDI policy before and after Make in India. See, I think before Make in India, the main objective of the government, main objective of the FDI policy is to attract and promote the FDI to supplement the domestic capital, technology, skills for economic growth or for making India. And the objective is same. Okay, under the MII policy also.
Okay.
Okay, and just I have checked the FDI inflows for 6 years before and after Making in India. So during Making in India policy, the FDI has a very extreme positive trend for the last 6 years during the Make in India policy. So how do you react about it? Yes, sir.
If it has to that extent improved the inflow of FDI, but I would like to know in which sectors and are those sectors which generate positive spillovers for Indian industry, because idea of encouraging FDI is not simply to increase the total investment in the country, it is also to expose domestic industry to more competition, best practices, and latest technology. That may be the more important contribution. And a lot of that FDI, to the extent it is in services, all our fast food chains, KFC and Wendy's and Domino's and all those. I'm not sure that is the kind of FDI that should be welcomed. If it is in manufacturing, especially with scope for positive spillovers to domestic business, then fine. But if it is in the financial services sector, as it has been in for banking and now perhaps in insurance, then we really have to see whether the repatriation of foreign profits is justified for the contribution that FDI will make. Anyway, that takes me outside the scope of today's talk, which was just on manufacturing.
Yeah, so we'll have a few sessions on FDI also. So Dr. Patra can raise the questions on that forum.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm much better experts on FDI than me.
So, sir, thank you very much for this extremely rich, enhancing session for taking us through the entire evolution of industrial policy. And we would like the participants to be in touch with you even after this session, wherever possible they can be guided by your expert guidance. So thank you.
So Rama,
yes.
before you conclude, Professor Bhattacharjea, I think it is indeed a very happy thing for me to have heard you about the entire evolution of the industrial policy, which I think we have dealt at various stages in the earlier form of this institute or even subsequently also. But I think we recapitulated and all we have brought out very categorically the sequence of the policies in 4 broad parts. And it has been my wish to bring you on some occasion to the institute. I think, had a conversation with you in 2010 when Professor Ashim was a director, but that was on different context. But I think I'm happy at least I could, you could be on our program, and I think in future, the new director being here, Nagesh, you will have much more interactions with him, and then your intellectual inputs to our colleagues and the faculty at the institute, sir. Thank you very much for accepting and delivering a beautiful talk on the industrial policy. We all enjoyed it.
Thank you, Professor Murthy. I hope to visit at some point. And of course, if people are interested in FDI issues, Dr. Nagesh Kumar is the expert on that subject. And you might want to have a special lecture by him.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rama, for organizing this. I won't say goodbye because I'm seeing you all next Monday also.
Of course, of course, of course.
Yeah. On a much more specialized topic.
Thank you, Professor Bhattacharjea.
Thank you.
To participants, we will have a 5 minutes break, and then you again log into the using the third lecture, the link which we have sent already. Thank you all for
Thank you all the participants. Yeah.